A very warm welcome to all of you on yet another session of our Fair AI's Thought Leaders Speak series. We have with us today Mr. Eitel-Porter. He's the Managing Director with Accenture Applied Intelligence and the European Lead for Responsible AI. And we will talk with him today about the responsible and AI aspects in their work at Accenture. Welcome to the show, Ray.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So first of all, let us start with your journey in the technology space, technology and AI space. So what got you excited about AI in the first place?
So I've been involved working in the analytics and then later AI space for, I guess, 15 years or so now. And I've always come at it much more from the business side. I'm not a data scientist myself by background. What fascinates me and interests me is the application of analytics and AI to business problems and to social problems, and the immense help and value that can be achieved by that. But I guess as technology has become more and more powerful, its ability to help and solve problems has increased, but so has its ability to cause problems if that isn't done in the right way. And so I think for somebody who comes at this from the business and the social aspect in particular, I'm very attuned to the need to ensure that we use AI, as indeed any technology, in a very responsible way to maximize the good that it does and the value that it delivers.
So in fact, your work and your interests are both bridging that very essential gap that exists between business and technology. Earlier in the earlier days, both used to work in silos, and now there's so much demand for roles like these that actually bridge that knowledge gap and help each of the buckets understand each other.
Yes.
Anyway, since responsible AI itself is a very new field of practice in today's world, so one of the challenges is to find reliable data. So, in terms of your experiences, what are the sort of data sources you would recommend for practitioners today who want to understand the current state of responsible AI in the space?
So I think that's a good question. I think it's actually a lot easier now than it was even 12 months ago and certainly 24 months ago, because quite a lot of work has been done on the topic by global institutions. I think if people were to look at organizations such as the Alan Turing Institute, there are bodies, joint bodies like the Partnership for AI. There are institutes like IEEE. The World Economic Forum has done work in this space. The European Union has published several very influential reports in this area, and indeed the House of Lords in the UK published, I think, a very good report in 2018 on the topic. So I think now there are quite a lot of good materials. I think the space that we're moving into, where there's still a bit of a, is around the implementation of the principles. So I think a lot of work's been done on defining the principles. I think the area for focus now is how do you ensure that those are actually implemented in organizations and really take hold.
So in fact, your mention of the Houses of Parliament in the UK reminded me that even in India, the federal government think tank called Niti Aayog has also been publishing some material, very interesting material on AI applications, the way it sees it for India. And hopefully subsequent versions should include a bigger mention of responsible AI and ethical AI practices as well. So based on all your experiences at Accenture and even previously, you've interacted with so many companies and organizations across the board. So in your view, which ones do you think stand out in terms of their AI responsible practices?
I think as a sector, I would say it's financial services, which is leading in this area. And I think there are a few reasons for that. One is that the FS sector has traditionally always been quite strongly regulated. Therefore they have very robust risk and governance mechanisms in place within banks, within financial services institutions. And AI is just one form of risk if you think about the negative aspects of applying it. So I think it's quite natural that these kinds of FS institutions are very attuned to the risks associated with AI. There are also organizations which are in many areas pushing the use of AI because they have traditionally done a lot of work in, let's say, fraud, using very advanced analytical techniques. So on the one hand, they want to drive the advanced use of AI in trading, algorithmic trading, and areas like this. Again, high use of advanced data science, but balanced by their deep understanding of risk and control mechanisms.
In fact, I'm probably going on a slight offshoot here. So when, say, for example, when you mentioned about regulators, the thing that struck me instantly was that previously we were just talking about, say, how your role acts as that bridge in that knowledge thing. How do you view the knowledge gap for the regulators? Because most of the people at the regulatory agencies are also people who came from either a legal or compliance or similar sort of backgrounds, who may not always be fully adept with the changes in AI-related technologies and what all it entails. So what's your view on that?
I think that's definitely something to be aware of. I think that many regulators have really gone out of their way to try to understand this new area of risk. Certainly in the UK, we see the regulators actively involved with the different industry participants. The UK, I think, was quite early, for example, in setting up sandboxes, which allowed banks to try out new techniques and to work with the regulator to understand those techniques in a way that the regulator had approved of, but allowed both sides to understand more what they were dealing with and what the appropriate approaches would be. So I think, yes, there is sometimes a bit of a gap, but I think it's also very important that regulators do really try to stay up with the latest technology. That said, I think often in this space, the technology moves so fast that it is incumbent on the technology companies themselves to behave responsibly, even if the regulator's a bit behind.
Yeah, in fact, it will be interesting to see if there is AI applications within the compliance space itself. So to say, to automate the regulator's job to an extent. But anyway, so we were, while talking about regulators, let me make that a broader question, in fact, because AI is a general purpose technology today that encompasses or crosses across business functions. And yet many of the details related to the implementation or the operational parts of AI application, not just in regulators, but the broader government, even the broader business community are still very unsure of all those specified nuances. So for this entire community, whether it is the government community, business community who lack that knowledge or who have that knowledge deficit, especially the non-technical people, what's your view on that? That how can they, bridge that knowledge deficit and so that they can make more responsible decisions on AI-related aspects?
I think it ultimately comes down to training. And I think it's critically important that training is developed and is provided for people at all levels in business. So really from top leadership, from senior leadership through middle management, and then to the actual data scientists who are coding on the front line, as it were. And in fact, Accenture is working with the Alan Turing Institute to develop a set of training materials and courses aimed at senior business executives, people who don't, to your point, who don't necessarily have that technical understanding, but who need to understand the implications and what their role should be in leading and helping to govern the technologies in their organizations. I think that's really important.
So in this entire responsible AI narrative, do you think the objectives of, say, the government and the business corporations meet and diverge at specific points? So in your view, what are those specific points where they meet and where they diverge?
Well, I mean, ultimately, this comes down to trust. And, people, users of AI systems have to be able to trust the systems. Otherwise, they're not going to be comfortable using them, and AI is not going to be adopted. And I think that in that area, the objectives of government and the objectives of business and organizations should be aligned. It should be in the interests both of government and in the interests of organizations that anyone who's using AI should trust it, should understand it, and that this should be, transparent and completely clear. I think the only instances where they diverge is where you have an organization that perhaps isn't as transparent as it should be. And personally, I would argue that that's actually short-sighted for the organization, because it's a sort of, maybe it gives a short-term win, but in the longer term, I think that organizations that aren't transparent and that don't build trust with their users will suffer, because ultimately that'll come out, and I think that there would be a backlash against that. So I think it's only in those sorts of negative situations where there's really a divergence between industry and government.
Any particular example, say one on each aspect that comes to your mind, say examples where they meet and where they diverge?
I don't have individual examples, but I think if I look back over, the last, let's say 20 years in the technology field, there has undoubtedly been a mindset shift where 20 years ago there were many more companies that would come from a mindset of what can I get away with, what can I get away with towards consumers, etc. And you had various forms of let's say marketing consent gradually being introduced, and through to most recently GDPR requirements. And I think as companies have been on that journey, I don't meet companies now who would use that phrase, what can we get away with? I can think 20 years ago of organizations that I would meet with who said, yeah, but what can we get away with? You don't hear that now. Now I think organizations are far more attuned to behaving ethically and wanting to build a trusted and fair relationship with their customers. I'm sure some people would say that not every company is like that, and I'm sure there are exceptions, but broadly speaking, I think we've moved a long way in the right direction.
But it's, interesting in a way where you mentioned that, the psyche of what can I get away with? And that actually leads me to a question, and maybe your quick comment on that, say when a period of stress happens, like we are in now after this COVID lockdown, there is an economic depression sort of a situation across a lot of countries, across a lot of emerging markets which were hitherto high growth, but which have fallen sharply in terms of GDP growth in the last quarter. In such periods of stress, the psyche of the business corporation to conserve cash and to reduce investments often becomes, let's do stuff that we would not have done otherwise, because the situation probably compels them to do so, and sometimes that end up taking unethical decisions. So do you think this current, based on your experiences with the companies now, do you think this post-COVID stressful situation can actually cause a situation like that, a scenario like that with the company psyches?
So I haven't observed that, but I can certainly understand the risk that you're pointing to, because clearly in difficult times, it can become harder to make the right decisions, and it requires perhaps more resolve to make the right decisions, and because that may not always be the most expedient or the cheapest. But I would I'd come back to the point about trying to encourage the longer term view that says that ultimately, companies tend to be rewarded by their customers, their consumers, for behaving in the right way.
And in fact, I mean, before moving on, I'll just add a caveat here that probably what stands out in the COVID crisis that we are in is that the use of, say, online platforms by consumers for various requirements has exponentially increased. And many of those platforms use some form of AI or the other, that actually it probably raises that question once more, that are all these platforms made in a responsible manner? But maybe that's food for thought for another session. Moving on, so I mean, in essence, a lot of industry leaders say that AI development should be in line with the core values of a corporation. But why is it that one finds a lot of companies deviating from this? Probably an offshoot of the previous question, but nevertheless, your views on this.
So I was intrigued by this question, actually, because I'm not sure that I see a lot of companies deviating from that, except by mistake. And maybe that's what maybe that's what your question is sort of is hinting at, in a sense, because I honestly don't think that there are companies who are intentionally trying to behave unethically. Maybe there are some, but I don't. That's not something that I see. But what I think we have witnessed is quite a number of examples of things that have gone wrong unintentionally, and I think that is where companies have become or are becoming increasingly aware of the risks. And to the point I made earlier, that is where we need to really focus on the gap, as it were, between principles and execution. And what are the things that we need to put in place as organizations to ensure that our good principles are followed, and that there are the minimal number of opportunities for something to go wrong.
In fact, here in, say, countries in emerging markets like India, the last 4, 5, 6 years has seen a trend where a lot of companies, especially the large cap, mid cap companies, have institutionalized the Department of Business Process Mapping. So, which was earlier not looked at as a function worth, considering. But because of these situations where that unintentional issues or errors in the way the company does its business arises, that the value of business process mapping has suddenly risen manyfold. Hopefully, we will see such departments in even more organizations going ahead.
I think it's a very good example, and what we see organizations wanting to do, and we very often work with organizations in this space, is helping to set up very robust governance processes along the data science life cycle, if you like. So starting from the initial ideas around using data and a model, are those ideas ethical? Is what you're trying to do appropriate? Then thinking about the data sets that are going to be used to train, then thinking about the modeling itself, and then thinking about the model in production and monitoring it during its use to ensure that it remains faithful to its original objectives and tests, etc. And having checkpoints through that process where independent review takes place to ensure that what's being done complies with the set of standards and guidelines, etc., which that particular organization has defined.
In fact, one more caveat I'll add to your point, the observation you said about the review part, because now, especially say after the pandemic, a lot of social organizations have also launched a lot of AI-based tools for a lot of purposes. And social organizations, especially in emerging markets, were never known to be monitoring and measuring their impact in a verifiable manner. You know, one thing is shown, that is fine, but whether it is verified and accurate or not, I mean, there's no audit process the way it happens in a private sector company. So in fact, that probably raises another question, or maybe food for thought, in the sense that for social organizations particularly, the pressure to ensure that all these review and checks and balances are happening is probably much, much more. And especially if the use of AI and tools increases in that domain, I mean, we have to see what will happen. Maybe 2 years later, we'll be having this conversation in a very different light, but nevertheless. Ray, let's move to the issue of people and teams. So recruitment of people, do you think that at the time of recruitment, or while the person is there in an organization, they are given ethics training, especially where I'm talking about the technology people here. Are they given ethics training while they are working, or questions about ethical aspects are asked while recruitment itself? Do you think that is happening? And if so, if some organizations are indeed doing so, what really made them want to do so?
So definitely we see plenty of organizations that include ethics training for their data scientists, for the technical teams. And what I've also seen is an increase over the last year, 2 years or so, of including ethical modules within universities that are training our future data scientists. And indeed, I've had conversations with some people in the academic world in the UK that there are some institutions that are thinking of setting up dedicated courses or significant modules that would be focused entirely on the ethical side of data science, and actually trying to train a generation of people whose focus is on the really understanding the techniques and approaches to verifying and checking for ethics, because it's a bit of a different branch to the science versus the people who build the models in the first place, and it can be very valuable to have that independent check. So I think the training is happening. I'm sure it's not as widespread as it should be, but we see it growing and being implemented more widely. And I think the second part of your question was around the motivation and what's causing that. I think, to be honest, it's organizations seeing cases in the news of problems that have arisen with other organizations, and recognizing that the reputational risk of a mistake in this area is really bad. We've seen plenty. I don't need to repeat them. People will have seen many of their own examples of this, and people like Cathy O'Neill have unearthed many examples. ProRepublica have done a lot of work in the space. There are lots of examples of problem areas, and I think that's made people sit up and realize the potential risk of not doing this.
In fact, the public relations risk, or the public relations debacle, becomes even more manifold in today's social media age.
Totally. Yes.
Yeah. So Ray, you had mentioned about data sets previously. So let's come to that. One of the common challenges, because when we test AI algorithms on historical data sets, is that there are a lot of different types of biases inside that data, and the data processing, carries forward those biases. So in your opinion, how can, technology applications, when they are developing new such applications, how can they ensure that these biases are effectively and efficiently addressed? The challenge biases, rather.
Yep. No, understood. there are an increasing number of technical approaches and which are being developed and being used to allow data scientists to evaluate the data sets that they use for bias. Some of the well-known ones are SHAP and LIME and so forth, but there are other techniques as well. And a number of different organizations have tools that people can use in this space. So I think it starts with awareness. The data scientists need to be aware of this as a potential problem, but then they also need to be trained in the use of appropriate tools so that they can profile the data set that they're using and understand what are the inherent biases in that data, and then importantly, what's the impact of that on the modeling that they're doing, because different purposes and different types of model will be impacted in different ways by the biases that are in the data set. And sometimes the purpose may mean that it is actually okay to include a particular sensitive variable in the data set. If I think about age, let's say, typically in many situations, age is not an allowable variable. It's a sensitive variable which should not come into models. But there may be certain types of modeling, perhaps in a medical context, where actually age is important because it may change aspects of the diagnosis or the treatment that you want to recommend. So it's very much context specific.
So Ray, we spoke a bit on the review aspects. So any further advice you have for organizations who want to institutionalize and formalize AI review framework? And any particular examples of organizations you think who have done this successfully?
So I think my recommendation would be absolutely start with a set of principles, but the principles need to be, and there are lots of examples out there of organizations that propose principles, but then you need to adapt those principles to your organization, because the principles have to be right for the values of your organization. But then you absolutely need a very robust governance framework which will ensure that those principles are adhered to and executed through the organization. I think an independent ethics board is quite a good idea. And I think it's critical as part of the governance process that an organization understands, defines who is going to make the trade-off decisions, because in many situations there will be a trade-off between bias and accuracy. So, as you remove bias from a data set and from a model, often the accuracy of that model will decrease. And there is no black and white answer as to what is correct, what's allowable. An organization will have to make that decision for itself. And you need to be sure who's going to make that decision, who is empowered within the organization in a particular department or in a particular use case, who is empowered to make that trade-off decision, on what basis. And then that has to be documented, because it may be that a regulator or a customer, somebody else comes back at a later point in time, the courts, and wants to understand, well, who made this decision that this amount of bias was allowable in this particular model. So I think it is all about having these really robust governance frameworks and tools that are embedded in the model selection and development process, and some independent review as part of that is also really important.
So Ray, maybe as a conclusion, if you couldn't share what is Accenture's, the future plans, the long-term vision it has in terms of supporting organizations in this process of making AI more responsible.
So actually the area that we work most strongly in is the one that I just described. It's in helping organizations to set up these governance frameworks, and in providing the kinds of tooling that will help them to ask the right questions during the modeling process, document the answers, and then monitor the models when they're actually in production. I think that if you have an existing risk and control framework, such as a bank. I'm working with one bank at the moment on this. They have sophisticated risk and other governance and compliance controls in the bank. In that sort of situation, it's important that you embed the controls for responsible AI into the existing framework. You don't want to have a separate governance framework just for responsible AI, because that's confusing and it adds layers of complexity and so forth. So there you need to take the existing framework and figure out where does AI ethics fit into that framework, and how do we use it to implement it. On the other hand, you may have some organizations that really don't have that heritage. They haven't really had a need for particularly strong and sophisticated governance, compliance, and so forth. So there you need to set things up more from scratch.
So in fact, Ray, maybe as a parting thought, any thoughts on responsible AI specific to emerging markets that you just want to sound out for our audiences? Some maybe 2-3 points that come to your mind.
Yeah, I think actually, responsible AI is interesting in the sense that I think it's actually quite global. I think the issues and approaches, etc., are really quite transferable from one market to another. So I'm not sure that there are, too many emerging market specific scenarios. The only sort of counter to that would be regulatory regimes. Financial services organizations, again, will see that the regulatory requirements and what is allowable in the area of modeling differs quite significantly according to the local market. So there you need to have a global framework, but you need to implement in the context of local regulation. I suppose the other thought that I might have for emerging markets is, in some ways, it comes back to this point of trust and not trying to behave in terms of what you can get away with. And if you're dealing with a broad population, you've got to be particularly careful that you live up to the responsibilities that you have towards that audience, to ensure that you build trust and you don't abuse trust.
Fantastic. So Ray, many thanks for taking the time out for our session today. We'll conclude here. Thanks for sharing all the useful insights, and I think we got a lot of food for thought. We wish Accenture all the very best in its future endeavors in this space, and have a nice weekend ahead. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. I wish you the same. It was an interesting discussion.